Well, let me reiterate my admiration and respect, General, for you and our military leaders and the difficulty of the task before them. I think you are one of America's great heroes. But I continue to worry a great deal about the message we are sending in the region, about whether we're actually going to stay or not, and whether we're going to do what's necessary to succeed rather than set an arbitrary timeline. And the best way to
We're going to recess for...
We're going to recess now for a few moments. We recess till the call of the chair.
Welcome, everybody. We're live here on Left Reckoning 33. Just seeing Petraeus there, showing the only reaction that you should be doing to anything that John McCain is saying is to hide your head in shame. My name is David Griscom. I'm broadcasting to you live from Austin, Texas, and I'm joined as always by my good friend Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, Dave. It's good to be speaking with you this evening. Yeah, David Petraeus, lose consciousness when you are told that the problem with Afghanistan is a messaging one.
Exactly. Yeah, no simple solutions to that. Very, very good that we are out of there, and I'm hoping that it stays that way despite all the kind of rabid and bloodthirsty commentators that we've seen over the past week, man. It's really been something else.
Yeah, unbelievable, the detachment. And it was even called by, I forget what her name was, but she's like, this is something that 95% of I'm going to fade out. There we go. 95% of reporters will be upset about, and something that 95% of Americans will agree with. And what's interesting about that is, I'm forgetting who pointed this out, but very few members of the squad actually came to Biden's defense on that too. Ilhan Omar, as far as I know, was the most vocal in tweeting that sentiment out, that actually there's a detachment from the National Security Reporting Corps and what typical Americans want from Afghanistan, and our military's presence there.
No, I think that's absolutely critical. And, yesterday I was talking a little bit about the media, and I think it is one of those things that's important for people like us who might be a little bit plugged into politics to remember that they're just trying to set this narrative all the time to try to defend their worldview and their kind of insanity that is very much detached from the wants and the desires of the vast majority of American people who are tired of these wars. And I think that that's a positive development that we've seen, and don't let them lie their way back into it, basically.
And early indications, not that polling should be the decider of everything, but when it's positive, it's fun to talk about as propaganda. People don't seem to be buying it. People seem to be, although, Biden's
I think people are tuned out for the most part.
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, that's
despite the fact that, obviously, I don't know, I don't want to, obviously this is a historic moment for a lot of reasons, so it's not a surprise that it's being covered so much. Mm-hmm. But I was having a moment recently when I was just sort of, scrolling through New York Times, Washington Post in the morning, being like, man, I have not seen an event covered like this intensely. In a very, very long time, other than, presidential election, like this much focus, right? COVID, 2020, Afghanistan. I haven't seen anything that has basically just been the dominant news story every day for a couple weeks now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Again, like you said, there's a good reason for that, actually.
But the wild thing about it is, I just don't find it to be registering that much with everyday people. Right, I haven't had a casual conversation about it once with anybody that I've seen from my normal life.
Yeah, because it's so focused on the withdrawal as that is the one thing we need. And even some Democrats are saying we need to investigate this. And Seth Moulton went to Afghanistan saying, let's get to the bottom of what went wrong with the withdrawal. It's that's not mm-hmm. where the problem started. Right? It's like investigating a giant heist and just focusing on the getaway. Right? No, you need to go back to who was planning this thing and why we were there in the first place, which was, again, rudderless from the very beginning, like the mid 2000s. This already is making its way to the press, and this very like through certain outlets, I should say, but this media corps covered for the occupation, and again, like didn't really even covered for it by not covering it. I guess I should say, just leave it completely off the pages.
I mean, that's the irony too. Is like there's been all these kind of media, media criticism reports, sort of highlighting how little coverage Afghanistan had received in the national media in the past 2 years, right? And it was something egregious. I can't remember off the top of my head, but definitely less than an hour.
Oh yeah,
of coverage, and now, as I was saying earlier, it's wall to wall. But I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to cover in the future, and obviously, as we see the fallout from the disastrous American policy of war and occupation in that part of the world, we will be talking about it here on Left Reckoning. But in a little bit, we're going to be joined by Chip Gibbons, who is going to help break down what's going on with Daniel Hale, who helped expose the brutality of the American drone program, along with Julian Assange, who is now being targeted by the Biden administration as well, right? And I note during the interview that it is sort of incredible that as Biden's sort of, walking away from that chapter of American history in some sense, is litigating and chasing after as much as possible somebody like Julian Assange, who again is being persecuted. He's being persecuted for politics. He's being persecuted. He's being persecuted to send a message to journalists across the country. All that and more, along with some Nixon tapes. I
had to play some Nixon tapes to Chip. Whenever there's somebody who knows like significantly more than me about this stuff, I have to bring back my obsession with Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger talking about you can't have a government if they could take whole file cabinets. That's, I mean, he's been talking like that since the 70s. That's what's the early 1971. He's been talking like that.
It's incredible, and they're bringing Kissinger back on to talk about Afghanistan. Pretty insane.
Oh yes.
The continuity there. And then a little bit after that, Matt's going to be giving us an update on the pipelines, and in the post game, we're going to be going through a really magical piece of writing by TMBS and Left Reckoning favorite, Mr. Friedman, in the New York Times, where he goes through an imaginary conversation with LBJ, Xi Jinping, and the last king of Afghanistan. Matt will be going into it cold. Really looking forward to that.
Only a genius writer could stretch the limits of imagination and construct a conversation like that. And Friedman, I think, is just the ideal man for the job.
Well, you're going to be really surprised, too, because all of these men seem to have a lot of respect for Friedman, too. They look up to him in a way. And who would have imagined that, let alone Friedman himself?
It's sort of like a empty suit launderer of whatever the elites want. I think a lot of them would probably respect him.
Yeah. But anyways, before we get to that, we have a few things we wanted to get to up top. And let's just set the stage here with this. This is the main thread. It's all going to be touching labor and workers' rights in this country. But this is a reminder that we need a hell of a lot more from our institutions on the federal level. I know a lot of our friends who made the argument that it's worthwhile to hold your nose and vote for Biden in 2020 used arguments around the NLRB and OSHA to make that argument that basically it was important, even though Joe Biden is not going to bring in some kind of utopia for working people, that they might be less egregious than what Trump had put forward, right? And these are some challenges to that thesis, honestly. I want to start by talking about a reality that we're all sort of living through. It's summer. It's getting extremely hot, and we are seeing the effects of increases in climate change, increases in temperature on working people. There was in the Pacific Northwest in the past few weeks, a farm worker collapsed and died because of heat exposure. And all across the country for decades now, we have been seeing a very startling rise in people collapsing and dying from heat exposure, or also having negative health effects from being exposed to the sun and the heat for extreme times and under extreme temperatures. And we can sort of zoom in for a second on Texas, which is a hot as hell place. It's a place that has really egregious protections for working people on the state level. And there has been an attack on provisions put forward by city governments in the state of Texas to make sure that workers get things like paid sick leave, right? Some of you should have during a pandemic, and water breaks. And, just so people understand the politics around it, the reason they're doing that in the state of Texas is because it's the Republican Party. The attack that's happening on these city regulations are put forward by Democrats. And now the Republican, state legislature has been targeting these protections and is basically trying to outlaw the ability of city and local governments from being able to make any kind of restrictions on businesses and on working conditions under their jurisdiction, right? Which again is absolutely ridiculous. It's turning your back on the entire concept of democracy, but that's how the Republicans govern. That's how they play. So people understand that like this is certainly an attack on workers, but the reason they're trying to do it is because they want to try to weaken the power of the Democratic Party, right? So SB 14 is a bill that basically will restrict and eradicate all those protections that have been hard won too. People should really know, if you're from out of state, that especially on the protections for sick leave for workers, that came from labor organizers and committed socialist members of the DSA who really put their feet on the ground and were showing up and got that victory won for working people. And now it's being targeted by the Republican legislature. And they have the ability to do it now because the Democrats, people might be familiar, who had left the state in protest of these, anti-democratic voting restrictions being put forward by the Republicans. Enough of them have come back in, which is now basically opening up the door for a free-for-all of all these really nasty GOP strategies. But let me read here from Grist, which had a really good piece about the heat wave and water breaks for workers. So this is from a piece called "More Workers Are Dying from Heat. Texas May Make It Harder to Protect Them." More than 30 million Americans earn their living doing physical labor outdoors, according to a Union of Concerned Scientists analysis of census data, and increasingly, they are working in extreme heat. From farm workers and foresters to construction and maintenance workers, outdoor workers are up to 35 times more likely to die from exposure to extreme heat than the general population, according to past research, right? So this is a nationwide problem, and one where people are trying to come up with a solution to them through the political avenues that are available to them, that is being sort of squashed by the Texas GOP, right? And it's something that they should 100% be being called out on because it's egregious. These kind of protections need to be expanded from what they even were in the first place, right? We're talking about, if I remember correctly, people being guaranteed the right to have a water break every couple of hours on the site, right? This is not some kind of like really, soft restrictions. These are just basic restrictions to make people that are able to hydrate in temperatures that, easily climb over 100 degrees. But again, this is not just the problem in the state of Texas. In the Pacific Northwest, which is now struggling from extreme heat that is not, typical in that region, more and more people are facing these extreme temperatures and that have been life-threatening. Washington and Oregon have issued emergency standards, but those are temporary, and there's a promise to expand those in the future. Maryland has promised that they will issue heat rules next year, and Virginia is in the process. I'll bring this up because this is having to become a statewide fight because there is no federal guideline on heat protections for workers. And in the context of climate change, that is something that it's so basic that it's egregious that that's the case right now, especially given the fact that when people pass away on the work site because they don't have access to water because they're exposed to so much heat, OSHA doesn't issue any citations or condemnations or anything of that matter. Why? Because they have no rules to govern them by. And we have heard from the Biden administration that they're going to explore the possibility of creating a heat standard, which again, good on them, I guess. But this is one of those things that it's going to take a few years. They're going to bring in all of the people.
It's a nice press release.
This is going to hurt business. Yeah, it's a press release. And this is something where the government needs to be doing a hell of a lot better to protect people. And I just want to remind people of the stakes, Matt. If you have these first little bits here, farm workers in this country have been in the front lines of a hell of a lot, from COVID to heat waves to attacks from the police. You just scroll down to this video. This was taken, July, and I believe in the Northwest Washington. I could be incorrect. But these are people working in extreme heat and extreme conditions because of the wildfires out there, right? These are people who every day they go out and they put their lives on the line to make sure that you have food on your table. And these are people who are harassed by our barbaric immigration system. These are people who are harassed by horrible bosses and the kind of conditions that come with doing temporary work. And in this case, this is something that is very simple, that the federal government should be stepping in to make sure that people have the kind of basic protections that they need here.
Man,
On that, I don't know if you have any thing you want to add to that before we get to these other things.
No, I mean, it just these are the sort of people that we've had. Stephen Robbins at Yakima Abogado.
Mm-hmm.
These are the people that he represents often. And I mean, that seed with just the red sky and that how awful that air is to breathe. And when it was in New York the other like a month or so ago, and to literally be the people that are feeding the country. And also, that have I'd noticed an American flag in the background, probably for like that's an American pathology that would place that flag there. But yeah, let's continue.
No, that's probably true. I mean, yeah. I mean, anyways, these things are just so basic, and it just is a reminder of how much of a fight we have for labor rights in this country. Having the right to water at work should be something that's a no-brainer.
Oh yeah, I was trying to think earlier, like what would a particularly onerous water break regulation even look like? Like it forces the company to give you like one of those hats that you wear to football games that has like water bottles. Like even just like when you're thirsty, go drink water that should be made available. That's like a baseline of having a business, I feel like.
No, exactly. And I'm sorry. It's amazing to me that you can have an organization that's supposed to regulate working conditions for people, and they could come and see that, somebody died very much or was injured very much because they didn't have access to water and they were exposed to extreme heat, and they can't do anything about it because there's no rules on the books for it. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And all when you talk to anybody or read anything about it, the reason cited is always, businesses and construction corporations tell them that, too much regulation is going to hurt their bottom line. And this is just one of those things that is just clear as day, how shallow that excuse is. That is just an excuse for them to be able to exploit people as much as they physically can. And when they push them a little bit too hard, it protects them from any kind of suit.
Yeah, look, I want to protect our workers from heat stroke, but the bottom line, like when you have to make those calculations, you shouldn't be a business.
Yeah. And, so here's the thing. People are fighting back here to make sure that those protections were given in the first place. And, there are avenues to win, but we have to be paying attention to all the different, assaults that are going on. And I want to move on to this Nabisco strike because so much of the labor struggle that we're seeing right now is fighting about, basic things like water at work, and then protecting the kind of basic things that were won by the labor movement, 100 years ago. So people, I'm sure, are very familiar with this massive strike that has been ongoing. We're seeing people who have been, on the picket line in Portland, in Aurora, Colorado, Richmond, Virginia, Chicago, and Norcross, Georgia. This is one of the largest strikes Nabisco has seen in 50 years. This is an incredibly large strike by American standards in general, just knowing the context of the lack of labor militancy over the past couple of decades. I believe it's something over 1,000 workers are on strike today. And what are they striking about? They're striking because people were being forced to work 16-hour days as demand increased over the pandemic. 16-hour days. You learn this in high school. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours to do what we will, right? These were demands made over a century ago, and people are fighting for those again today. It was one of those, it was interesting. I was listening to the radio the other day, and there's this story going on about how much productivity is up in the United States and how surprised people are by it. I don't want to, talk too broadly about it because, the economy is very big, but it is interesting to hear things like that when we hear about the stories they're going on Nabisco, Frito-Lay, Tyson's Chicken, right? People were basically being forced to become more and more like machines on the shop floor. Nabisco, though, Matt, they're very kind, and they have found a middle ground. They have offered people 12-hour shifts and they will work less during the week so that they don't have to get paid overtime. Again, this is exploitation at its most basic. This is completely ignoring people's, lives outside of work, the what we need as human beings. And it's an absolutely despicable, situation. But if it was just the hours, right, that'd be one thing. But there are also assaults on their pensions and on their wages all across the board. And you know what? I apologize, Matt, because I didn't bring it to give it to you, but I'll just read this from their statement in response to the strike. And this is from the Mondelez International, which owns Nabisco. Our goal has been and continues to be to bargain in good faith. Well, and this is the interesting little turn they take, right? While also taking steps to modernize some contract aspects which were written several decades ago. And by that, what they mean is they want to eradicate people's pensions, and they want to be able to pull back all the other benefits that were hard-won a long-ass time ago. This completely just blows in the water any kind of argument here.
Remember that grandmother from earlier? The people that hacked her.
What's going on?
I guess John Oliver is talking in my background. I was putting up a...
Oh, that's good, though.
These are the salaries. I got Oliver. Yeah. I kicked John Oliver out. These are the salaries from Mondelez International. Let's just take a look at this. Okay, 16 million for chairman and executive Dirk Van de Put.
Well, that's a very modern salary.
Yeah, look at how this is modernization. Glenn Walter makes a cool 4.2 million. Luca Zaramelli 7.3. Maurizio Brusadel 4.6. I mean, this is a very modern company.
No, it's beautiful, man. No, I mean, it's so absurd. And, we just have to know where we are to fight back. And the good news here, though, is that this is absurd and people are fighting back and they're using the right kind of language and they have the commitments that are needed to push back. But it is amazing to see that, so much of our fights right now really are, relitigating fights from the past. And that means that we need to be sprinting as much as possible to bolster and build out the labor movement. You could play a little bit from this More Perfect Union video, and thank God for them, because they've been doing an incredible job covering strikes all across this country. It's a really hopeful and beautiful project. But this is play a minute or so of this.
Fall off of her chair recently and broke her ankle. We didn't have a nurse here. The supervisor wouldn't take her off of the line. We're treated like animals.
They made the most money they've ever made last year during the pandemic, but yet they don't want to give us what we're asking for.
It's like, go ahead, kick me again when I'm down. You just proved to me you're right. I'm just a number to you.
They have introduced what they call AWS, Alternative Work Schedule. So what they've done is actually changed the work shift.
You just know when a corporation gets in the acronym coining game that it's not going to be good for you. Like, oh, we got this fun little thing called alternate fucking you over.
From 8 hours to 12 hours. Now, after 8 hours, we get paid overtime for anything over 8. Now we're working 12 hours, and they're paying us a straight time.
The minimum lifting is 50 pounds here. We don't even have water fountains throughout.
Water again, though, man, Jesus.
This is a bakery. It can get to like 110 degrees in some areas. I mean, piping, smoking hot. And you're telling us that you want us to work 12 hours a day. How are you supposed to get your children from school working a 12-hour day? How are you supposed to make a family life work? How are you supposed to get dinner on the table? The math doesn't add up.
By changing the length of time that you work, they're able to eliminate.
I mean, it's those videos are so great. People should check out all of More Perfect Union's work. But this is extremely powerful stuff, and it's great to see people pushing back and fighting back against these systems because they're absolutely egregious. I don't know. It's amazing too to see. It's water and heat again are showing up. I mean, these are basic working conditions questions.
Yeah, I mean, and the repetition, it wasn't in that clip, but the way people are recognizing that these companies are forcing you to work like machines.
Yeah.
Like when I look back at, you read about whatever period of like labor unrest history, it's like, this is when people hopefully have the luxury to read back at our time. Like that's what will be the sort of chorus, is like, we're expected to operate in a way that is not compatible with the human existence. And we recognize that. And they should give away this company, again, like the record profits, or most revenue, and guys bringing home $17 million a year, and basically crack the whip on people that feel like their lives are being ruined because of what they're being asked, just for the basic amount to like sustain their lives,
let alone
in money.
Let alone the fact, as they know at the beginning of the video, that these companies are extremely profitable.
Yeah.
They've been making more money than they ever have. So it's absurd to talk about modernizing contracts, right? When you're seeing record levels of profit, and this is the time that you feel like, okay, well, we need to be squeezing workers, we need to be cutting their pensions. I mean, it just shows the game there that there is no level of profit that is acceptable to capitalists to start to share the value that is created by workers with the workers. That's it. They're going to try to pay you as little as possible, and that's why these union fights are so critical, and why it's great to see these fights continue. And I know this is big 1, 2, 3, but I want to also, go to Alabama for a second too, because we started this clip by talking about how these institutions need to be doing a lot more for workers, right? And I'm sorry, but this is an example where, regarding the NLRB, I think that they need to be doing a hell of a lot more. It's a tricky one with them because they need to have a lot more power than they do, but with whatever power they have, they're not even really using it. So this just came out today. This is a press release from the UMWA. For people who aren't familiar, over 1,100 mine workers in Alabama have been on strike for almost 6 months now. And we've done a lot of videos on it, but just for people to know, these people, they suffered during the downturn, the financial crisis. They voted to lower their wages to make sure that the company could survive. The company gets bought out by a bunch of capital interest firms, many of them located in New York, including organizations like BlackRock. And now the mine is profitable again, and people who sacrificed to make this company work are now asking that they go back and maybe even get some expansions on the wages that they were earning over a decade ago. And they have been met with violence, smear tactics, and a hell of a lot of unsavory moves from this company. And this is here from the UMWA. After I'll just read the top bit of it. Open season on strikers in NLRB Region 10. The United Mine Workers of America announced today that it will appeal the dismissal by the National Labor Relations Board, Region 10, of several unfair labor practice charges relating to vehicular assault by Warrior Met coal management personnel. The NLRB said there was insufficient evidence that any pickets were struck, despite both video evidence and eyewitness testimony. And if you have this here,
video,
this video, this is as clear as it gets. That's not the only one. There will be another one too. These are not the only examples. These are not the only times that it happened. These are ones where we have very clear examples that caught on video of them purposefully ramming into the picket line.
This could have broke this guy's hip or leg very
easily, right? And this is just so that they can break the picket line and get scabs into the mines. If you just and you don't have to go back to the thing, but they also note in the statement too that now where are these workers to turn, right? The state troopers haven't shown up for them, right? The state government hasn't shown up for them. We're not seeing very much from the Biden administration and all these people who claim to care about American workers, right? And now the NLRB isn't showing up for them either. I think it's great that they'll appeal the decision. You have to fight in every avenue that you have. But Jesus Christ, this is just the most egregious and clear example. And by the way, those truck strikes are not the only example of illicit tactics used by Warrior Matt to try to attack these people. But Jesus Christ, this is as clear as day. And you have to have these organizations that were set up to make sure that corporations couldn't get away with attacking people. You know, these were set up to basically prevent us from having those kind of bloody labor fights that we know from all the stories of the American labor movement. And they're doing nothing as these things are on the uptick, as these kind of unsavory attacks are on the uptick.
I mean, that brings me back to the Richard Wolff debate with Destiny, where Destiny asked, how much coercion are you willing to see institute your, give desired economic system? And the truth about our current economic system is it has always required force, and it's going to continue to require force. We'll talk more about Tiger Swan, the North Carolina-based mercenary firm that is suing to suppress documents related to their infiltration of leftist groups, and on top of lying about how much activity they were doing because they didn't get a permit to operate in North Dakota. But that'll be after our Chip Gibbons discussion. But yeah, man.
I just wanted to note too, we'll definitely be covering this more. If you could just flash the strike fund, if you have that, if people feel able to donate to the mine workers there, that would be very much appreciated, because in addition to all of this nonsense, people who have been leading the strike and family members who have been instrumental have now been served with lawsuits by a Warrior Mat. So while the legal system sort of fails working people, our opponents are able to navigate it with a lot of certainty. And we need to make sure that we have all the resources for people to be able to fight back against that, because it's absolutely absurd.
Yeah, if you're doing well and can write a check or something, that I think now would be a good time to.
Because those suits are a very frightening thing to get when you've been on strike for 6 months.
Jesus.
But the fights are happening. Like, the thing is that, like, we can focus on the negatives, and you have to, because you have to be prepared to know what's going on. But the resolve isn't broken there for these people. They're continuing to fight, and they continue to show up every day, as they're doing at Nabisco, right? And this is the kind of thing. It's like, it's not going to be a one day, show up and we get victory. But seeing this kind of mobilization of working people across the country, like we've seen, honestly, I mean, this is, has been a historic couple of years for labor in the United States. And, a lot of people are sort of, really getting mobilized. And that's an encouraging thing. We see the conflict, and it's hard to see the conflict because it's difficult to go up against these companies. But seeing the conflict means that, there's movement, and there's mobilization, and there's hope. And that's the kind of like positivity you also have to take with it, while also equipping yourself with the facts and not getting rosy eyes and thinking that, going on strike is just having a picnic, right? It's a fight. It's a fight for your life against some of the most powerful people in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, people that aren't afraid to play dirty. And on top of which, we should say at Warrior Met, the scabs have been causing pollution issues as they try to fill in their peers. So, yeah. Where to now? Should we do a brief pitch?
Yeah, we can do a pitch. For people who are, who enjoy this work and, the coverage that we've been doing, we've been really appreciative of all the growth we've had. And we're starting to get really close to our goals, which are going to be critical for us to be able to start expanding the show and what we're able to cover. I'm hoping down the line, I think, I don't know, we maybe have to come up with a specific goal for when we'll be able to do that. But to be able to start taking this thing on the road a little bit, I'm assuming that's definitely an intention, if not by the end of the year, by next year. Mm-hmm. And, we also are giving you 2-to-1 content on the other side, right? You're getting the post game. You don't want to miss Matt and I going through this piece later. We'll take your Discord questions, hang out a little bit. And then we also do our bonus episodes. This week, we're going to be joined by a good friend of mine, Rob McPherson, who's going to talk about TV production and the unglamorous conditions that many of the workers and production assistants who make the things that you watch regularly go through, right? And we're able to tell those stories and have those conversations and have fun and to do something different than you're getting from a lot of other shows, even left shows, because of your support. So definitely consider supporting us at patreon.com/leftreckoning.
Yeah, and if you are a digital worker, or particularly in the video game industry, you will want to check out our interview this last weekend with Emma Kinema who's an organizer with Game Workers Unite, talking about, how instead of boycotting companies that have issues with crunch, for instance, we need to make the knee-jerk response, particularly for members of media, about empowering those workplaces democratically and in the form of unionization. So check that out. That's another one that I always feel guilty about putting stuff behind the paywall. So we'll release that to everybody. But we talk about Activision Blizzard and everything like that. So patreon.com/leftreckoning for that. So now let's take a brief break. We'll get to Chip Gibbons, and there'll be more after the Chip interview as well. I'm going to get into these pipeline issues. So here is David and I with here we go. Chip. Welcome back to Left Reckoning. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom.
How's it going?
Hey, David. And joining us tonight is Chip Gibbons. Chip is a journalist focused on civil liberties, seen it In These Times, Jacobin, The Nation. He's also the policy director of Defending Rights and Dissent and the host of the Primary Sources podcast, which everyone should go subscribe to. Is that like a successor to your Still Spying
Yeah,
podcast?
So to give a little bit of background, both Still Spying and Primary Sources are limited series podcasts. They don't go on forever. They deal with a particular topic and explore it in depth from different angles. So Still Spying was about FBI political surveillance. We had just published a report called Still Spying on Dissent about contemporary FBI surveillance. I was giving speaking events about it, including one in New York. Afterwards, I was sick for a month with a mysterious respiratory illness. And then I got unsick, and then everything closed down because of COVID. So we were thinking to ourselves, like, well, how do we promote this report? And we came up with the idea of doing a limited series podcast about FBI political surveillance. And as it was winding down, it was a very successful project. We had a number of very eminent historians, like Ellen Trucker, like the foremost historian of McCarthyism, Abdeen Jabara, a Arab civil rights attorney who was the first person the NSA admitted they had spied on in the 70s, like first US person. We decided we wanted to keep this format up. So Primary Sources is also a limited series. It doesn't go on forever, but it is exploring the plight of truth tellers and whistleblowers who expose civil liberties and human rights abuses committed under the guise of national security. It's predominantly focused on the U.S. Espionage Act and how that's been used to stifle dissent. And now we're going to talk about Assange and Hale in a minute. But as it goes on, we hope to explore a couple of sort of adjacent things that, asides that I have a great interest in. I made them allow me to do. I made them allow them to let me do one episode on Gary Webb. Which isn't really a Espionage Act truth teller, but is a journalist who was silenced by the corporate media. And we're also going to Winter Soldier, the sort of hearings Iraq veterans and Vietnam veterans against the war would have about. So we're going to, at the end, go off on some interesting directions. But the main crux of it is Espionage Act bad.
Yeah, and actually, there's the very first episode is with Daniel Ellsberg, and we'll be returning back to the Pentagon Papers a little bit later in this interview. But first, David, why don't you start us off with the Assange?
Yeah, I mean, Espionage Act is a perfect segue there. But I want to talk about Assange, one because Assange is always salient, but it's especially important to note right now as Biden is pulling the U.S. out of Afghanistan, and we might be closing this book in a way. That the U.S. government at the very same time is working again to try to extradite Assange to the United States.
He's not from here.
Yeah, after their initial attempt was rebuffed by the UK legal system on human rights grounds. And as we know, Assange played no small role at all at exposing American and UK war crimes in Afghanistan and around the world. Could you sort of inform the audience about where this case stands today?
Yeah, so Julian Assange is the first person ever indicted under the Espionage Act for publishing information. Daniel Ellsberg was indicted under the Espionage Act for giving the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. He was a government insider who had information, and leak is the phrase. I don't like to use leak. I think it's a pejorative connotation. I'd say liberate. He liberated the Pentagon Papers. Edward Snowden, was a government insider who liberated the NSA spying scandal. Chelsea Manning gave Assange those documents. They were all prosecuted, but they weren't the publisher. And traditionally, there's been a real hesitation to go after the media when they actually publish this information. On the other hand, they've been quite ruthless since the Obama administration in going after the leaker, whistleblower, the source. And I think it's really worth stressing that the war on whistleblowers that Obama sort of cemented has always been a backdoor war on journalism, right? With Assange, they have crossed the Rubicon into the thing that Obama was concerned about because of the so-called New York Times problem. How do you set a precedent to indict Assange where you can't indict the New York Times? Remember, the New York Times worked with WikiLeaks early on to publish much of the same information they published. WikiLeaks worked with The Guardian, with Le Monde, with Al Jazeera, with Der Spiegel, all of these sorts of mainstream papers to publish information about U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan, U.S. war crimes in Iraq, the Guantanamo Bay detainee files, and just information like that. There's been 3 separate indictments against Assange. They keep releasing this thing called superseding indictments where they add more charges or more facts. The current charges against him, though, there are 18 charges. 17 of them are brought under the Espionage Act. And you'll read, and it'll be like unauthorized release of defense information or unauthorized retention of defense information. And then it will say in parentheses, in the indictment, in the charge itself, what that defense information is. And it will say Iraq rules of engagement. It will say Guantanamo Bay detainee files, right? Very explicitly, or State Department cables, very explicitly naming these documents that were released and that were in the public interest. So Assange is being charged under the Espionage Act with leaking the Guantanamo Bay detainee files, with leaking the Iraq rules of engagement, not leaking, publishing. He didn't leak them. He's Australian, has no obligation to protect the secrets of the United States government. And then I believe it also throws in the State Department cables, right? I'm looking at the indictment in front of me right now. It says count 3, unauthorized obtaining of national defense information, parentheses, State Department cables. So he is unauthorized obtaining of national, count 4, unauthorized obtaining of national defense information, Iraq rules of engagement.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's clear as day what they're, why they're so threatened by Assange. And it's frustrating sometimes when you hear people talk about it in the U.S. too, because there's been a kind of like separation of what the U.S.'s case against Assange is from most people's like perception of what's going on in the public. I get a lot of people get worked up about, Assange, discredited himself in the 2016 election. It's like, this has absolutely nothing to do with that. And also that'd be a really absurd thing to go after somebody for publishing information about a candidate that you like who didn't win the election. But yeah,
Assange has been the subject of a ruthless campaign of demonization. Obviously, he has certainly said and done some things that I personally, disagree with, but those are not while he's on trial, right? Yeah. He is on trial for publishing the information Chelsea Manning gave him, the Guantanamo Bay detainee files, the State Department cables, and the Iraq rules of engagement. And I mentioned there were 17 charges brought under the Espionage Act. There's an 18th charge that defenders of the Assange persecution like to trot out. And this is this very bizarre conspiracy to commit a computer intrusion charge. Yeah. It starts off with this very weird claim that Chelsea Manning wanted to access someone else's administrator profile on her computer, so they couldn't track the leaking back to her. And Assange offered to help sort of crack the password. It's not clear he ever did. And that was what it was in the first indictment. That's what it was in the second indictment. First superseding indictment, second indictment. And then the third indictment, this sort of last minute change that keeps all the charges but changes the narrative. This is after the extradition hearing is well underway, after his defense is raising political questions, right? Assange is wanted for political questions. He shouldn't be extradited. And the U.S. government just comes back with this like kitchen sink narrative that they can bring in with the conspiracy charge, accusing Assange of sort of all of this various hacking. One of the sources for that, who makes his first appearance in this indictment, has admitted to lying to the FBI. He also was labeled a sociopath and a sex offender by the Icelandic court system. There's just weird stuff in there about him talking about how WikiLeaks should help Edward Snowden, and just all this sorts of bizarre stuff. And, it's hard to look at it and not be cynical that this is just like this kitchen sink approach of throwing out a bunch of stuff that sounds derogatory in order to try to make this look like something that it isn't, right? Not a political persecution of a journalist, but certain sort of sycophants of the national security state and haters of Assange have taken great comfort in this third indictment, and they're not justified in doing so. But, haters gonna hate, I believe is what they say.
Yeah, that seems so revealing of their motives. The whole 17-1, and then the one is hacking. Like
conspiracy to commit computer intrusion.
Yeah.
We don't even know if he intruded the computer or not.
I just no, I mean it's completely absurd. But like, so the U.S. case now, though, the U.K. they ruled that it would be a violation of Assange's human rights if he were to be extradited. So and that has been appealed, correct?
Yeah. So the UK judge rejected all of the press freedom arguments put forward by Assange's defense. But at the last sort of minute, she ruled that it would have been mentally oppressive to Assange to be extradited to the US because of his mental health, because of the likely prison conditions he'd be in, and because of the likelihood he would commit suicide in a U.S. prison. And the U.S., and it's very interesting because under the U.S.-UK extradition treaty, the U.S. is represented in U.K. court by Her Majesty's prosecution at the expense of the British taxpayer. So the U.S., through the Queen's Counsel, is appealing this, and they were granted raise, I believe, 5 issues on appeal. They were granted the right to raise 3 of them, including this claim that they should have notified the U.S. so the U.S. could put assurances about his conditions, as well as those actual assurances. What they were initially not allowed to raise on appeal was sort of challenging the judge's medical conclusions, right? The judge made a ruling based on her hearing of various medical facts. She interviewed, or she heard from various psychiatrists from both the defense and the prosecution. And she decided the defense psychiatrist was more trustworthy or had more veracity, and that it weighed more to her. And the U.S. was initially blocked from challenging those medical conclusions. They wanted to argue that one of the defense psychiatrists, the evidence from him should have been deemed inadmissible. And thus, if she couldn't have heard that evidence, she couldn't have ruled that Assange, shouldn't have been extradited to the U.S., and also that she erred when assessing his risk of suicide. It's very rare you get to appeal something like that, especially in the U.S., but they went before this law lord and this law lady, and they have reinstated the U.S.'s appeal rights on this one. And the issue is that the psychiatrist she relied on did 2 reports for the court, testified under cross-examination, turned over all of his notes to the prosecution, but in his earliest report, he did not disclose that Stella Morris was currently Julian Assange's partner or fiance, and they had 2 children together, because she asked him not to due to the credible threats against their life, and that he felt this was a preliminary report and that he was going to get legal advice on how to deal with the issue. The defense is adamant he never would have concealed this from the court. By the time, he could even get legal counsel, Assange and Morse have gone public with this information. He mentions it in his second report. He gives his contemporaneous notes from the first report that includes this information. But the prosecution wants to argue that because he didn't disclose this in this one preliminary report, that the judge didn't even see until after she knew, otherwise, that he somehow wasn't objective and therefore everything he said should be thrown out. And he interviewed Assange, he interviewed his family, he interviewed childhood friends. He did this very extensive psychiatric profile of him, the most rigorous of any of them. And the prosecution just wants you to throw it all out because in this one preliminary report, he doesn't mention, Julian Assange has 5 children as opposed to 3, basically.
Yeah, it's absurd. And I know we have more to get to, so I'll let us get there. But I just want to note, as you reported, I believe in Jacobin too, that Assange having worries about the safety of his children is like a legit worry, as it's been revealed that like the U.S. Was considering like stealing his child's diapers, if I recall correctly.
To do a DNA test. So there's this private security firm at the Ecuadorian embassy called UC Global. I believe they're a Spanish firm. There's an investigation underway in Spain right now into their conduct. Several of the people who worked with them have come forward and said that the UC Global was in fact working with the CIA to spy on Assange while he was in the embassy. And one of the things they wanted to do was steal one of the diapers to determine via DNA whether or not this child was his or not. They also claim they considered kidnapping and poisoning Assange.
Jesus Christ. Yeah. I mean, again, we'll jump into this other stuff, but I just want to say to the audience, it's like, this is a very clear case, not just the case against Assange that the U.S. has been making, but the way that they've been treating him covertly as well. I mean, this is an attempt to silence and threaten somebody who is publishing information that proved to the world that the United States was engaged in atrocities and crimes against humanity, right? I mean, that's it. It's just, it begins and ends there. And I don't care what other narratives you want to throw out there. What's happening to Assange is another crime against humanity, one that you should take very, very seriously.
And human rights advocates have been able to use some of this information to challenge drone strikes in Pakistan, to give information for Guantanamo detainees to be used in their proceedings. One of the Guantanamo detainees used this to file with the International Criminal Court and was named in their sort of war crimes investigation into Afghanistan. So the result of this information, it wasn't just newsworthy, but human rights advocates representing victims of drone strike, representing people in prison at Guantanamo, have been able to actually make use of it to advocate for their clients.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned drones. I think let's use this opportunity now to move to the case of Daniel Hale. I think just as revealing of the menacing of whistleblowers and assault on civil liberties. So you had a piece, Daniel Hale went to prison for telling the truth about U.S. drone war. Tell us who Daniel Hale was and his significance to our understanding of the world today, and also the way his punishment is sort of for his righteousness in a way.
Yeah, I wrote 2 pieces for Jacobin about Daniel Hale, one after he pled guilty and one after having attended the sentencing hearing, which was very depressing. Daniel Hale was a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. He was assigned to the NSA and thus stationed at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. Bagram is where they do the drone strikes. He was part of the kill chain where they sort of would use people's cell phones to track them. They could then have drones follow them around to spy on them, but also assassinate them, right? This is both a surveillance and a global assassination program. And while he was sitting in Bagram, he wrote a very moving letter. He also gave a very moving speech in the court. The transcript isn't from yet. I mean, he describes the first time he witnesses a drone strike. He said, he's talking about there's this sort of wanted Taliban individual. He gathers in the early morning with other men who are armed, although as Hale notes, where he's from in Virginia, carrying arms was not outside the norm. nor is it in Afghanistan. And they were drinking tea. And because these men were military age, they had arms, and they were in, the vicinity of a enemy combatant, it was okay to kill them too. And he just sort of describes this in his letter. Despite having peacefully assembled, posing no threat, the fate of the now tea drinking men had all but been fulfilled. I could only look on as I sat by and watched through a computer monitor when a sudden, terrifying flurry of hellfire missiles came crashing down, splattering purple-colored crystal guts on the side of the Morningside Mountain. By the rules of engagement, it may have been permissible for me to have helped kill those men whose language I did not speak, whose customs I did not understand, and crimes I could not identify in the gruesome manner that I did. Watch them die. But how could it be considered honorable of me to continuously have laid in wait for the next opportunity to kill unsuspecting persons who more often than not in no danger to any other person at that time? And he describes similar things in this letter. And then when he returns stateside, he goes to a book event of journalist Jeremy Scahill. He later appears on stage with Scahill. He attends a Code Pink anti-drone summit where someone who is a victim of the drone strike whose family is a victim of a drone strike, describes it. Hale, sitting in the audience, having watched it take place on this computer screen. He then gets a job as a defense contractor with Leidos, as I believe the name of it, at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency to sort of work on geo mapping of China. And while he's there one day, his coworkers decide as entertainment, let's watch videos of drone strikes, at which point he decides that he has to end this cycle of violence by sort of putting his own freedom in jeopardy. And he goes and gives this information to Jeremy Scahill. And, one of the things these documents show is that during one 5-month period in Afghanistan, 90% of those killed by U.S. drone strikes, or not U.S. airstrikes, were not the intended target, 90%. And The Intercept publishes information first about the no-fly list, which is used by Muslim American civil rights groups successfully to challenge people's wrongful placement on it. And then they publish the drone papers, which is this groundbreaking look at sort of this human cost of the drone program based on these documents. In 2014, his home is raided by the FBI in connection with a Espionage Act investigation. In 2015, a year later, The Intercept publishes the drone papers. In 2019, we're now 5 years later, another presidential administration, he's indicted for under 5 counts, multiple counts of the Espionage Act. And then in 2021, he pleads guilty to violating one of the counts of the Espionage Act. And then he is sentenced to 45 months in prison for this.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your piece the way the judge sort of, I don't know, did you say sympathized with, or also wanted to send a message about, like, don't be too righteous in the wrong way?
Yeah, it was very interesting to watch because the government has a playbook with these Espionage Act prosecutions. It's remarkable. It's so similar on case by case. They always say the person was a narcissist, they were a malcontent, they had no good motives. And in this case, the prosecution tried to argue that Hale was motivated by vanity and wanting to advance his non-existent career as a journalist. Hale was very reluctant to mount any kind of public campaign for himself as he was being railroaded by the government because he wanted the focus to be on the victims of drone strikes, not on him. When he was arrested, he was working as a dishwasher, right? The idea that he is a vain guy who wants to be a rock star journalist, as the prosecutor asserted, is just like pathetically, right, like divorced from reality. And, the judge did acknowledge, and this usually does not happen. Usually the judge buys into, the prosecution's demonization campaign, that a number of people had written letters to him. I sent a letter requested by the defense to the judge lots of people did as well. And that they thought he was courageous and conscientious and a whistleblower. And the judge agreed with their assessment, but that he could have been a whistleblower without giving these documents to Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept, and that many Americans would have applauded him for alerting them to the civilian casualties of the drone program. It's really weird to watch because the judge was, acknowledging Daniel Hale was courageous, acknowledging Daniel Hale was conscientious, and acknowledging that the U.S. drone program kills a lot of civilians. And the American people, if they knew this, would be outraged by it, which is not the way things normally go. And it's worth pointing out the government wanted like a baseline of 9 years. So they got like a third of the sentence they wanted. And Hale's sentence is actually shorter than some other recent Espionage Act prosecutions for similar people. Had the prosecution got the sentence they wanted, it would have been the longest sentence ever given in a civilian court by a long shot, and it would have been the longest sentence ever served by anyone. Chelsea Manning got 35 years in a military court, but Obama, I believe, commuted her sentence after like 7 years. I think that's what he commuted it to. He didn't pardon her. He didn't free her immediately. He just commuted her sentence to a lesser sentence. So she was actually still in jail for months and months after the commutation. I don't think people realized that. He just sort of reduced the sentence, didn't immediately free her as he should have done. And so it's a real sort of mixed bag of emotions because 45 months, Daniel Hale should not be in jail a day. And 45 months is still an outrageously long sentence when you look at the broad trajectory of whistleblower prosecutions, but it is not what the prosecution wanted, and it is not in line with this recent sort of escalation of things, right? The prosecution wanted to take Reality Winner's 5-year sentence and argue that's the baseline sentence, everything else should be longer, and the judge didn't go along with that, to his credit.
It just seems so bizarre that sort of psychoanalysis would be relevant in a courtroom. Like he wants to start a journalism career.
Yeah, I mean, who cares?
Yeah, I mean that's.
I mean, a lot of people are motivated by personal vanity to do good things, right?
Yeah, and I think another thing that's really worth mentioning is why Daniel Hale probably pled is just that he had no meaningful chance of a defense. The Espionage Act language is written something like intent to or reason to believe could harm U.S. national security. The way that judges have interpreted this is that if you get this notice that classified information can harm the U.S. when it's released, and government says it's classified and you release it, you have reason to believe it will harm national defense, no questions asked, so you're guilty. So in most of these cases, literally all you have to prove was, did you give it to a journalist? And that's usually known. And the prosecution will ask the judge, and in Hale's case, like in every other case, the judge agreed to bar Hale from mentioning his good motives. Hale was also not allowed to challenge the classification of the documents, both because classification is the sole domain of the executive branch. A judge can't rule a document is wrongfully classified. And even if he could, and even if a document was wrongfully classified, being properly classified is not an element of the Espionage Act offense. Hale was also not allowed to bring up the fact that it was selective prosecution, that many people leak information. They're not prosecuted. You're only prosecuted if you leak information the government doesn't, that embarrasses the government. So this is a political prosecution, like all Espionage Act prosecutions of whistleblowers. And he wasn't even allowed to assert that someone else could have given the documents to Scahill unless he could name a specific individual and explain how he did it. So zero chance of a defense. In sentencing, Hale's lawyers asked the judge to compel the prosecution to disclose any evidence of harm. The prosecution fought that, saying the Espionage Act doesn't require harm. They're not going to argue he harmed the U.S. national defense at sentencing, and the judge rules in their favor. And then they turn around and say, because Hale isn't acknowledging the grave harm he's doing, he's not truly sorry. He's like a heroin dealer who says, dealing heroin is good for the community. That's the actual analogy they use. And they even flat out assert he aided ISIS, which, okay, show us the harm assessment then. So they fought to not disclose evidence of harm because they didn't have it, and then said, oh, you're not admitting you did harm, even though you wanted this evidence of harm. You're not significantly remorseful. Throw the book at them.
Man, that is frustrating and disappointing as I guess an American citizen. Well, let's take that energy back 40 years, if you will, Chip. Listeners of this program will know that I have a longstanding fascination with the Nixon tapes. This takes us to the morning of June 14th, 1971, the morning the Pentagon Papers were released. And this is Henry Kissinger. First, we're going to hear from John Mitchell, the United States Attorney General, who is, as far as I remember, suggesting legal action against the New York Times, and then Henry Kissinger comes in. And I just want your response to this. Feel free to tell me to pause whenever, but as a civil liberties expert, here's.
I love these Nixon tapes too. So
this is a great one too. Because Nixon, people won't know, but he got the news from Alexander Haig earlier and hadn't seen it in the paper.
And the reason why is because also on the front page of the New York Times was an article about his daughter's wedding. And he was much more interested in the Patricia Nixon news than the Pentagon Papers. And Haig and Kissinger had to come direct him to the story next to it.
Exactly.
I'm not making this up. This is
absolutely true. And if you read the Nixon or listen to the Nixon tapes, you'll hear a lot of calls about that wedding. They were very preoccupied within the lead up. It's big news in the White House.
Hello, Mr. President. What is your advice on that Times thing, John? You would like to do it?
I would believe so, Mr. President. Otherwise, we will look a little foolish in not following through on our legal obligations. And
has this ever been done before?
Publication like this, or
no. Has the government ever done this to a paper before?
Oh yes, advising of their. Yes, we've done this before.
So that part, I just want to stop there. He says advising them of their, and then he kind of trails off. That is kind of like the chicken shit way of the Nixon administration, never really naming what they want done. Really, which he's saying like, well, we're going to threaten a lawsuit, correct?
So I don't know about the advice thing, but that is a routine thing they will do in the government. They will advise papers not to publish stuff. I was sort of finishing up our interview with an NSA whistleblower today, and I was going back through the story by which the New York Times published a 2005 story about illegal NSA spying of U.S. citizens, and the journalist had the story for over a year, and the New York Times kept blocking them from publishing it because the NSA and the Bush administration lobbied them not to. And finally, the one was like, "I'm going to publish this in my book," and then the New York Times got very territorial and did so. So they do advise them not to publish stuff, and sometimes they do listen, like the NSA warrantless surveillance story. The New York Times spiked for a year during the Bush administration. And had that story come out before the 2004 election, could it have changed the outcome? Probably not. I don't think much, but it is a big question we have to ask.
Right. We'll continue a little bit more with this. And the final question I want to ask about this is, have things gotten worse? But we'll continue here.
Paper before.
Oh yes, advising of their. Yes, we've done this before.
Have we? All right.
Yes, sir. I would think that.
How do you go about it? You do it sort of low key.
Low key. You call them and then send a telegram to confirm it.
Mm-hmm. And say that we're examining the situation and we just simply are putting you on notice.
Well, we're putting them on notice that they're violating a statute because we have a communication from Mel Laird as to the nature of the documents, and they fall within the statute. Now, I don't know whether you've noticed it, but this thing was. Mel was working.
Henry's on the other. He just walked in. I'll put him on the other line. Go ahead.
Mel had a pretty good go up there before the committee today on it, and it's all over town and all over everything. And I think we'd look a little silly if we just didn't take this low-key action of advising them about the publication.
Did Mel take a fairly hard line on it?
Yes, he gave a legal opinion, and it was a violation of the law, which puts us up. Yeah, we have to get.
Well, look. As far as the Times is concerned, hell, they're our enemies. I think we just ought to do it. And anyway, Henry, tell them what you just heard from Rostow.
Well, Rostow called on behalf of Johnson, and he said that it is Johnson's strong view that this is an attack on the whole integrity of government. That if whole whole file cabinets can be stolen and then made available to the press. You can't have orderly government anymore.
Well,
and he said if the president defends the integrity, any action we take, he will back publicly.
There you go. That was
that's Kissinger at the end, right?
Yeah, that's Kissinger at the end.
That's somebody who is still invited by these assholes to go and speak and opine on American interventions around the globe while he's talking like that about the papers or something else, man. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and it's worth noting what the Nixon administration does is they enjoin the Times from publishing the story. Then the Washington Post published it, and then they're enjoined, and it goes on. And then finally it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules you can't impose a prior restraint in this case, but they don't get them after the fact. So while the Pentagon Papers case is a First Amendment victory for prior restraint, there was very much a chilling of the printing of it. And Mike Gravel, Senator Mike Gravel, reads this into the Senate record and then moves to try to get a person to publish it. And because you can still be prosecuted after the fact, no one wants to publish it except for the Unitarian Church Beacon Press, which publishes an edition with, I believe, annotations by Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky. And that's a whole First Amendment battle in its own right that oftentimes gets overlooked, sort of the small left-wing Unitarian press, which did a lot of heavy lifting versus a sort of celebratory attitude we have towards it, which we should celebrate with the Times. So they did stand up for principle, but it is unfortunate that they sort of get all the credit and Beacon Press does not.
Yeah, there's also the element of just the assassination of Ellsberg's character, right? Like Nixon sending hatchet men to break into his psychiatrist's office.
It brings down his presidency. That's the beginning of Watergate. It unravels his presidency, his obsession with Nixon, or not with Nixon, with Ellsberg. And if he had just been left to his own devices, he would have been more fixated on his daughter's wedding, and perhaps would have served out his term.
Yeah, there you go. Dave, do you have something you want to? Chip, I got a hot potato to throw your way.
I know you do. I know.
So the way I formulate it is this way. So we have all this history that we're aware of as sort of the right and the FBI and the way it attacks the left. And we're now in this sort of, I guess, even in the 9/11 era, with the sort of use of informants to basically entrap Muslims. That pattern recognition is all here. And now we're seeing it applied in a way that is a little bit harder to, I think, field, which is the right-wing extremist threat being used as a way to bolster the national security state or domestic spying. How are you looking at these developments?
Well, it's a very complex problem, and a lot of people on the left can be very divided about it. I understand that a lot of the sort of fascist violence is targeted at it's not. Some of it is sort of, mass violence, but some of it is targeted. So people do feel very personally threatened by it in a way they might not other forms of violence. And it is very horrific, right? It is grisly to watch. So far as there is a terrorist threat to the United States, or a threat of violence to the United States, right? It comes from the right, it doesn't come from the left. Al Qaeda did attack us on 9/11, but bulk of the sort of violence like that in the interceding years has come from the domestic right. So far as you can say, this type of violence is a problem, and you can talk about the degree to which sort of interpersonal violence of any nature is or isn't a major problem. It is coming from the right, and I understand people who feel very threatened by this being very concerned. The history of the FBI and law enforcement with the far right is a very complex. I think we oftentimes on the left want it to be a straightforward history, but it's very complex. It can be very difficult to wade through. Local law enforcement has traditionally, in the South, collaborated with the Ku Klux Klan and was absolutely part and parcel of Klan violence. We see things like that going on today, like the Portland police and the Proud Boys. On the other hand, there are FBI agents who infiltrate right-wing groups from time to time, and they're instructed to limit information they share with the local police because the local police might turn them over and get them killed. Gary Rowe is the most notorious FBI Ku Klux Klan informant during the 60s. He murders people, right, and gets away with it because he's an FBI. There's no question that he killed people. I can go and we do a whole episode of him on Still Spying, and you can listen to that and learn his unsavory past. But one of the things he did when he was in the Klan was that he beat up freedom riders, and the Birmingham police told him they had 15 minutes to beat them up, and then they would come like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" Stage sort of intervention, and he told the FBI, and they did nothing about it. But also there's an incident where he does tell the FBI about violence coming, and a state trooper pulls them over. How many of these are the Klansmen? And the state trooper flat out says to Rowe, the FBI informant, "You've got a snitch in your midst." And threatens one of the Klan members with violence. A sheriff does if he talks about some of the bombings. So very, very mixed record here. And the FBI did initiate a counterintelligence program against the Ku Klux Klan and similar groups. And it wasn't a fake COINTELPRO. Like sometimes we'll go, that was just for show. It was real. And the rationale for it is interesting on a number of levels. The Kennedy administration, Bobby and John F. Kennedy, are liberal anti-communist. They're also committed to civil rights. So when there's these grisly murders of civil rights activists, especially realistically white ones from the North, they're putting pressure on Hoover and others like, why don't you do to the Klan what you do to the communist? And the other thing to remember is that counterintelligence program is not a law enforcement program. It's an intelligence program. The FBI is both a law enforcement and an intelligence agency. What does that mean? I know in the age of like abolish, we've all come to accept that the police are about social control. But like in theory, the police are supposed to be gathering information for prosecution. Intelligence, you're just, doing stuff. So they moved the Ku Klux Klan stuff out of the criminal division of the FBI that could prosecute them and put it in the intelligence division, and instead focus on these disruptive activities where they like dox people and get them fired, or they instruct Gary Rowe to sleep with Klan wives to break up marriages. And as the Church Committee found, unlike the other COINTELPRO operations, especially that against the Black Panthers, this one was the most narrowly tailored to people who were actually engaged in violence. If you have evidence that someone is a violent Klans member, is it better to like intervene and prosecute them, or intervene into restorative justice, which isn't actually an option at this point? Like prosecution is your option. Or is it better to sleep with their wife and break up their marriage? Like which is the better thing to do? And I have strong feelings about that. On the other hand, today, let's jump to today, then as well, the FBI has immense political bias against civil rights and Black Lives Matter activism. The Hoover refused to investigate the lynching of Emmett Till, saying there was no federal jurisdiction to do so, even though the Department of Justice, which the FBI is a part of, was founded to go after Klan violence in the South and prosecuted hundreds of people in the 1860s during Reconstruction for doing this. Hoover said there was no such law, and it was just a communist plot to get things whipped up. And similarly now, we sort of see right-wing groups plotting violence in broad daylight, and the FBI is chasing around people who are engaged in political speech. So what do we do with the sort of real threat of real violence from these groups on the right, but also we don't want to bolster the security state? And what my position is that the authorities of the FBI must be limited to looking at instances where people are actually breaking the law and actually engaged in violence. That would stop them from these fishing expeditions against Palestinian activists, against Occupy, against Black Lives Matter, where they say, well, they're not plotting any violence, but maybe they'll do so later. And it would focus them on some of these right-wing groups. And it would also force them to focus on some of these right-wing groups in a way that isn't just repeating the mistakes of the war on terror, right? I don't terribly think it would be useful for the FBI to devote a lot of attention to fishing expeditions where you're going after people with hateful speech and ignoring the people engaged in violence, right? You need to focus on those who are engaged in violence, and you do that by limiting the powers of the FBI and limiting their focus. I think the other thing you alluded to is that there's this weird sort of convergence of like longtime national security hawks with people who have good faith concern about racial injustice in this country, which is very real, to sort of create this campaign for expanding the powers of the FBI and the DHS and create a new domestic terrorism law in a way that's just going to allow the FBI to have even more powers that they'll use once again to go after Black Lives Matter some more, go after some Occupy some more, right? Well, not their Occupy is gone, but Occupy-like groups. And I think that's really concerning, and it's hard to know how to respond in an appropriate way when you read Joseph Biden's sort of domestic terrorism plan, the first time they've ever done a whole government plan about domestic as opposed to international terrorism. It has this narrative about domestic terrorism that I find very, very sympathetic, where they talk about violence during Reconstruction. They talk about the Tulsa massacre, but they're using that to sort of garner support for policies that we've already seen in the war on terror that are now being rehabilitated. And it's worth pointing out that Muslim American civil rights groups, Arab American civil rights groups, who've been the hardest hit by these programs, have for like half a decade now been extremely vocal, being like, no, 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 no. We don't want these programs to be equal opportunity. We don't want you rehabilitating them. We want you getting rid of them. And there was actually a huge, I don't know if this is public information or not. Some of the groups, there was Life After Hate, right? They got a Countering Violent Extremism grant to do stuff with former skinheads. They also got a grant to study radicalization in the Muslim community. And it was through this program called CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, that was opposed by the Muslim American community. And when Trump cut that grant off, there was a bunch of big liberal groups, big left groups that were, making hay of that. And like Arab American and Muslim American civil rights groups like quietly met with them and said, hey, please stop doing this. You're hurting our community. And they wouldn't do it. So if you're not persuaded by my very perhaps antiquated old school civil libertarian perspective, at least think about what the groups who have been impacted by the international war on terrorism are telling you, and maybe have some pause.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And it also reminds me, I think the House Un-American Activities Committee that originally was supposed to look into both the far right and the far left, and we know ultimately which side that came down on.
Yes.
And I just want to, one book, I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's a book called Phantom Terror. It's by this guy, Adam Zamoyski. And it's about the Clemens von Metternich sort of post-Napoleon phase in Europe, where he's basically the J. Edgar Hoover of Europe. And it's instead of anti-communism, it's anti-republicanism. And there's documentation from that time of guys having these meetings, informants having meetings with people and then reporting them. And everybody involved was an informant, but didn't know the other people were.
Is this the Metternich that's mentioned in the opening line of the Communist Manifesto?
Yes.
I never realized who that was. I should have been more inquisitive and asked.
Put Phantom Terror on your vacation.
Please send me this. Yes.
You'll like it. But Chip Gibbons, you can find him at Chip Gibbons 89. Where else should people look for your work, Chip?
Check out the website of Defending Rights in Dissent, rightsindissent.org. If you want to hear the Primary Sources podcast, it's available on all of the podcasting apps. There's more of them than I ever knew existed, but you can also get it at primarysourcespodcast.org, and you can find the FBI Guide podcast, which is now done at stillspying.org or on your podcasting app of choice. I had no idea there are so many ways to listen to podcasts. I've never heard of some of these things, but sometimes they delay putting one of the episodes on. They're like, oh, what about Stitcher? I haven't gotten to the episode. I'm like, what the fuck is Stitcher? Why are you DMing me this?
Oh yeah.
And it's just, you know.
The branches go deeper than that too.
Oh yeah.
I know. No, I know. That's just the one I can remember.
I know what you mean.
Thanks, Chip.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Chip is great. That is a knocking that last answer out of the park.
Yeah, exactly.
I
That
mean,
was really good. I really thought that was that was perfect. Really.
That's a difficult thing, and Chip's got a wealth of wisdom for that. Check out the podcast's primary sources. And let me turn my air conditioner. There we go. Before we go to the post game, let's run through this this pipeline update. If you will allow me. So I wanted to throw to Winona LaDuke. Well, this is actually 4 years ago, but Winona's like one of the best at speaking on behalf of people doing water protecting activities, water protectors, and this is from 4 years ago. But this is a really good summary of the Line 3 Enbridge replacement. They're saying, and it really goes back to, we've talked about in Texas, they've got the problem with abandoned oil wells. And this is the exact same thing. This is like, I think, being framed in a way that's like, oh, look at these protesters are getting in the way of us getting this new infrastructure. And really the problem is we haven't had an accounting of what the old infrastructure has been and done to the world. And so here's Winona introducing this.
What is Line 3? A lot of people want to know, and a lot of people don't know. So think of it this way. There are 6 really old pipelines that they put through in northern Minnesota, shipping diluted tar sands from Alberta to Superior, Wisconsin. And one of those lines is called Line 3. It has, according to Enbridge, about 900 structural anomalies in it. Structural anomalies are things like small little pinhole leaks, maybe some cracks, and some of those end up to be big problems, like that Kalamazoo spill. That was a structural anomaly. Line 3, it's old and it's corroding and it's at the end of its life. It's already had a number of leaks and spills, and frankly, it's a catastrophe waiting to happen. There is a likelihood that there is a whole bunch of contamination under the present line. And once that corrodes, our children and grandchildren may one day watch it drain a lake or a wetland or flood a farm field. Fixing these problems is very expensive, so Enbridge wants to abandon the pipeline, walk away, and build a brand new one in a brand new corridor. Enbridge calls this a replacement project. They're replacing Line 3. They are not replacing Line 3. They are putting in a whole new corridor and doubling the size of the line. That's not a replacement. That's a brand new line, and that's what's wrong. So we've got 2 problems. First, we've got a problem of the proposed new Sandpiper and Line 3 corridor through the heart of our best lakes and wild rice watersheds and through our treaty territories. We also have the problem of this old crumbling line that Enbridge wants to abandon. And right now, what abandonment means is that they just leave it and walk away. And the company says that—
I just want to say, on that, the topic of, through like the wild rice habitat, it's just so disgusting how we're so desensitized to the idea we're doing this to if you know anything about Minnesota natural history, like those wild rice fields are just sort of central, particularly to indigenous identity, but just like natural history of this planet, and we don't give any fucks about it at all. Yeah, I'll continue.
Another thing to plow through.
Right, exactly, like an obstacle. And I mean, to the extent it does matter, it's like, oh, that's maybe a leverage point that we can get the Army Corps of Engineers to step in on. But I'll continue with Winona here.
Not clear that there is any liability from the Enbridge Corporation. The worst part is that neither the United States government or the state of Minnesota has any plan to deal with it. The good news is that the Ojibwe tribes are standing up, and a lot of landowners, county commissioners, and mayors are getting increasingly concerned about who's going to be liable for Enbridge's mess. So tell Governor...
So that's fast forward to now, hundreds and hundreds of arrests. I think last Friday, 20 something people were arrested. In June, I believe 200 at one day. And I mean, again, like this idea that they could just forsake a pipeline and expect to not have to deal with that and just let us do another one because of how important this is. I mean, it's really insulting and gross. Where we're at now is it's close to being finished, unfortunately. The remaining sort of Hail Marys are getting the Army Corps of Engineers, similar to what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline, to revoke a permit that allows them to cross water. They've already crossed it's 22 river crossings, 200, and goes under 200 bodies of water. I've already had 10,000 gallons of drilling fluid spilled into those waterways in the construction so far. And like I said, Merkley, Ilhan, other Democrats are calling on the Army Corps to revoke the permit. And I hope it gets done. I guess I'll leave it there. But because this really is about Biden's credibility when it comes to climate. Mm-hmm. And we need to move on to that. And like I said, 247 arrested in June, 20 arrested on Friday. All I'll say about that is support the bail funds and for anybody, any water protectors, and also spread the concept of jury nullification, which you can't convict unless everybody agrees that they're guilty. And you don't need to, you can say like, I think that all that evidence is legit, but I still think not guilty. So look into that. Go ahead, David.
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to take away from the subject matter here, but this is like why like a jury trial has that kind of radical potential in my like perspective, in the sense that like, you know, the idea that like as a member of the society you can say like, we don't want to do this, like we think that the way that this is being conducted or whatever is wrong, and being able to, you know, intercede like that, I think is a very critical right.
And there's a conspiracy of silence around it too, to like let people know that it is a very democratic check on the legal system.
And it's so amazing. And then it's like, it's just at every moment, it's just weakened essentially.
Yeah. It's like, you know, the movie 12 Angry Men, where he like, you don't actually even need to persuade everybody. You should say like, I don't agree. Fuck you guys. I don't think we should send people to prison for drug offenses. So I'm sorry. Okay. So yeah. And yeah, oil companies are going to care as much as they are sued to care or compelled by the state to care. I want to move on to another pipeline in the area, the Keystone Pipeline. Of course, it's great that the Keystone XL was defeated. We had Joshua Kahn Russell on to talk about that. But let's just go into, you know, these shiny new objects that are being we're not allowed to have because of the nasty environmentalists. Here's a report from my hometown, West Dakota Fox, your news leader. This is, KFYI.
Oh, man.
KFYI report: Keystone Pipeline spills caused by design and manufacturing issues. Now, what other issues are there? Like,
I was about to say.
I mean, really, like, shout out to the construction crews, I guess, because that's, I guess, not manufacturing or design. So good job, boys. You put it in correctly. But
no offense, but that's such a local news headline. Like, you have no idea what happened from.
So and just to read a little bit from it, a new federal report from the Government Accountability Office says design and manufacturing issues are to blame for a series of spills along the Keystone XL pipeline, including 2 in South Dakota. And this is just a funny matter of fact way, like when you hear, and we'll get to the Dakota Access Pipeline to wrap this up, but when you hear assurances when a pipeline is going through, like for instance with Enbridge line 3, this is the most studied pipeline ever. It's so studied and it's going to be so safe. This is the reality of it. So while the GAO report states that pipeline has experienced a similar number of accidents compared to other pipelines, the severity of those spills has worsened in recent years. Keystone's worst spill took place in 2017 near the town of Amherst in northeast South Dakota. Over 250,000 gallons of oil leaked in that accident, according to the report. In response to those spills, as well as to North Dakota, the U.S. Department of Transportation ordered TC Energy to investigate and fix the root causes. The investigations found that these accidents were caused by issues related to the original design, manufacturing of the pipe, or construction of the pipeline. So I guess the construction guys didn't get up. So at all levels, failure. Okay, so that's a Keystone, and these are just the ones that cross North Dakota. Look, I'm a North Dakota boy. I'm sure there's other pipelines out there that need attention, but let's go now to the Dakota Access Pipeline, which unfortunately was approved, and we have a recent increase. Recent headlines are increase in capacity, or increase in barrels per day going through the pipes from just over 500,000 to 750,000. This in the context of a couple things. Remember what I said about those safety violations. So the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Keystone older pipeline, same with this old Enbridge Line 3. Let's see what a new pipeline can do. Let's see what these new bells and whistles. So here is a headline from the Williston Herald. Dakota Access faces fines, compliance orders for safety violations from 2017 to 2019. And I say like this is when this pipeline's been around. More than 9,500 alarms were set off in a 2-year period due to a wildly fluctuating nitrogen-reliant pressure relief valve system on the Dakota Access Pipeline, according to a notice of probable violation and proposed civil. So, like, I mean, your alarm systems. Try to think of it over a 2-year period. There's about 8 locations here. Johnson's Corner, Watford City, Trenton, Ramberg, Stanley, and Epping. I've been to Watford City. I don't know about the other places. 9,500 alarms. What is an alarm system? Like, that is a fucking Monty Python sketch that you have 9,500 alarms going off. Like, how would you know which one is real? Right? Like, it's just a false alarm. It's just like, it looks like there will be blood behind you.
Insane.
Local climate conditions were causing rapid pressure fluctuations on a nitrogen supply. I will say this about North Dakota. Rapid temperature fluctuations there. It's a place that, of course, gets very cold, people know about, but also can experience like just days and days of 100-degree heat. So might want to have the pressure release stuff. But so yeah, nitrogen supply, allowing the valve set points to fluctuate for such a long time, blah, blah, blah. And this is from the spokeswoman, Lisa Coleman, said the violations were identified in a standard audit completed in early 2019. But listen to this quote. All but one of the items identified have already been addressed or are in the process of being addressed, she told the Williston Herald, but she wouldn't say what the remaining issue was, so which is not how you comfort somebody. So, oh yeah, we saw all of that except one thing. Anyway, Dakota Access pipelines have received numerous litigation from environmental groups from Standing Rock, of course. So their alarm system's a mess. The other thing to just kind of jump onto the civil liberties angle of this. It's got an article from the Dickinson Press here. And this is about our buddies from Tiger Swan, the mercenary firm that was doing security work for Energy Transfer Partners, is currently suing the North Dakota Private Investigators and Security Board to suppress 16,000 documents pertaining to their use of Tiger Swan. Who the Intercept exposed. I got a few articles here in the Intercept that are very worth people's perusal, in how these companies are literally like infiltrating movements, sending goons in undercover to infiltrate. And I mean, ultimately, we talked about how a Fed informant planted a gun on Red Fawn Fallis and got her locked up for 4 years. But also, like, leaked documents reveal counterterrorism tactics used at Standing Rock's to defeat pipeline insurgencies. I mean, think about that as a terminology. And yeah, there's another good reporting by Aileen Brown. So that's what's going on with Dakota Access Pipeline. Capacity is up, more barrels moving through it, while the alarm system is completely fucked. And the company that has put in it there is trying to suppress documents related to their use of a mercenary firm that I believe got people bit by dogs. In addition to for that, that shouldn't be illegal, obviously, right? Like, it shouldn't be illegal for the Fed, like we talked with Chip. It should be illegal for the Feds to do that stuff. It shouldn't be illegal for private mercenary firms to put fake leftists and, get people to do whatever. I mean, manipulate in whatever way they want to manipulate. That manipulation shouldn't be legal.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely insane. It is. Yeah, I mean, like, it's frightening enough to think of the government doing it, but basically giving, opening the door for these private firms to do whatever they want.
And just one final thing. The
yeah.
only way this is even close, these documents are even, potentially going to be disclosed, is because Energy Transfer Partners was sued because they were operating without a permit in North Dakota. So they've been lying about the extent of their activities because they're in trouble for operating without a permit. That's where these came from. If it wasn't for that, if they were just permitted, then there'd be no recourse to get these documents at all. Is my understanding.
Insane. I mean, that was such a critical recap too of like touching on, these things are expanding as we speak. And the ones that are sitting still are extremely dangerous and damaging to our environment. I don't know. I know you brought this up at the beginning, but it is exactly like what we're seeing with like these abandoned wells here in Texas, right? Which is, we're going to profit from the natural resources of your society. We're going to pillage and destroy and completely ignore treaties that have been signed with native peoples. And also, when shit hits the fan, you're going to have to come by and find some kind of patchwork way to clean it up, because we're going to find a way to have absolutely no responsibility. And if you want to see any kind of window into what climate catastrophe is going to look like when it's like ×5, when this is happening, everywhere, this is a perfect example of it, right? It's going to come down to personal responsibility, right? We know, which is nonsensical, right? But that's what they're going to sort of argue. And they're going to say like, oh, create a community organization to clean up the shit that we did when we were robbing your community for decades, right? Yeah. It's horrifying. And I think I'm really happy to be bringing that up though, because it's one of those things that it just sort of like sneaks underneath the radar, right? These are those slow drip problems that you read about when they've gotten too big and you almost can't do much about them.
Yeah, and just to quickly address the best sort of arrow in the pipeline's quiver, which is the jobs they create. And I think it's a mistake to dismiss those kinds of jobs. The idea that they're not permanent for a certain community is definitely true. But like one of the pipeline workers has said in one of the articles I saw, like we still do this around the country, right? Like for us, those jobs are great. And that's to be expected from these sorts of unions, in my opinion, until we create the grounds, and this infrastructure package and Green New Deal and these sorts of things are important, because unless people see another place to sustain themselves with jobs, and it needs to be from Uncle Sam in this case, that's just to be expected. That comes with the territory, these sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's like exactly the kind of mentality that comes about from like forced scarcity too, right? It's like we need to hunker down and protect what we've got, because any erosion of that is going to mean like a lower quality of life for us, right? This is what we talked with Ryan Pollack about, right? This is why just transition is such an important concept, and it's something that you just can't skip, and it's been skipped, unfortunately, for far too long amongst the left and a lot of the environmental movement. But this is a great example as to why, like, not having done that outreach, puts us at a disadvantage now, and we need to sort of do double time to rebuild those bridges.
Absolutely. Well, folks, in addition to what we teased earlier, we're going to play a clip of Charlie Kirk attempting a sports metaphor, and in a way that like makes Jen Psaki look good, which is like really irritating to me. We're not on the Psaki bomb train.
No, not yet, at least. But maybe this clip will convince me. But in addition to that, man, when we were, when the video was playing, I was revisiting one thing that we're going to be doing too in the post game. We were looking at Elon Musk and this complete debacle from his premiere of his new robot. Spoiler alert: no robot showed up. And we're going to be sort of taking a walk down memory lane of all of the promises we've gotten from Bitcoin and the American tech community's most famous favorite billionaire, and all of the things that he has actually delivered, which when you actually put them on paper, it's really incredible to see how long this guy has just been sort of over promising and under delivering, and how much good press he still gets.
Just lost after. I mean, remember the truck, which still looks like shit, and he threw the ball bearing at it, and it just smacked like. And not a hit to his credibility among, the Musk boys. But
so all that and more. And, just wanted to mention a happy anniversary to everybody of 100 years of Blair Mountain Battle. We'll probably try to do something next week to commemorate it as we approach the commemoration of the end of the battle itself. But thanks everybody for hanging out with us today. and see you all on the other side.
Peace, folks.